computers in Seattle.
All right.
But we don't have them.
So this is the Seattle Blender User Group's HDR tutorial, which is impromptu in the hallway because we haven't been let into the classroom yet. You're just in time for the HDR tutorial.
Okay.
As we wait to be let into the classroom. So, HDR photography is something that has been very useful for 3D because you can use HDRs as basically much denser, light accurate images in your 3D scenes for image-based lighting. So if you imagine a ping, you think that's not a lossy format like a JPEG is, and you have all these pixels that are like RGB and they go from 0 to 1. And if you bring that into Blender or something, it might look like a picture, but it's not actually representing the environment that you took the photo in, because light is not made out of black and white. It's made up of photons, and there's no such thing as white. So when a photon hits David's eye and his eye is expanded really wide, it gives him sight blindness, and his head hurts a little bit because he's soaking in too much light. But
That's not actually what they are.
so when that same thing hits Joey's eye, and Joey has his pupil shrunk down, he lets in just a little bit, and the room is a different light spectrum. And so your eye is this complex machinery that's expanding, opening up. Shut up!
HDR.
Shut up! So HDR photography is when you're taking photos at different exposure levels and jamming them into like super files, which are called EXRs or HDRs. And then you can use that in a 3D scene to get image-based lighting. And we've done mirror balls here, and I'm starting to graduate to the harder but more accurate version of that, which is realistic 3D panoramas. So normally that camera would be over here. And let's talk about some setup, because that's one of the hardest things when you're getting into this, is you're basically taking photos and you're spinning around and taking all these photos in this direction, and then you'd move this, and then you'd take more photos, and then eventually you'd stitch all these together. And there's sort of a disconnect between taking the photo here and then manipulating the photos over there. So I want to give you some basic ideas of how you can start to set it up so that you'll get accurate photos for your final product. So one of the first things you'll notice is I have this tripod, and I have this ridiculous contraption up here, which is a pano head. And you're sort of going for two things when you shoot these. One is that you don't want parallax. So if you imagine I hooked the camera up here, the lens would be out here. So as I rotate, we would get parallax because the lens is not depicting a single point in space. So what we want is to be hooking our camera up here so that the lens is here. So that as we rotate, it's a lot closer to the central point. And the same thing with why it's out here. So I can rotate it up, and as I shoot the ground, it's still pointing from this approximate area. And if I rotate down here, it's still pointing in that single point. So then you don't have parallax. That's going to give you better stitches, and especially with stuff that's close to the foreground, it's going to be a lot more accurate. The next thing you're looking at is how often is this turning. So if you get a really expensive, good panoramic head, it's going to have like mechanisms that record like with little clicks how much you've rotated. So it'll go like click, and you can tell that you rotated exactly 15 degrees or 20 degrees. It'll click, 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 click. So it's a little easier to tell. And even fancier ones will have automatic motors. So you won't even have to have human error interfering at all, because when I go up here and rotate it, I'm moving the tripod a little bit. So a really fancy one has a motor on it that does the entire rotation, and therefore you have a lot less chance that your motions can mess it up. So the next thing that I do with this crappy version of the fancy Hollywood.
Oscar, is your camera going all the time while you're doing this? Is that?
Yeah, it's recording.
No, I'm talking about.
Or do you take stills, or how do you do the?
Yeah, he takes a still at every
Every 15 degrees?
Yeah, we'll get to that.
20 degrees.
Yeah, basically. So the next thing I do, this is my
Remote.
cheap, crappy version of this, is I just want to make sure that I have approximately the same degree of rotation every time I do this. So just get some junk, like coins or what have you. And so if you imagine these tripod legs as
Tell us a
3
tutorial
intersections.
When you think this gets you drunk.
So if you imagine these 3 tripod legs dividing into our 360-degree shot, that means we're at 120 degrees, 120 degrees, and 120 degrees. If you think you could reasonably eyeball lining up your camera with the tripod leg. And then if you could reasonably eyeball lining up in the middle, then you have 60 degrees. So if you just start trying to have approximate bookmarks, like if you put it here, then you would be able to go 30 degrees per shot if you're shooting at each leg, each coin, and in between each one. So if you then double that, this, again,
That's awful.
this is, yeah. So this is how you do the really, really cheap loser version of HDR photography. So now what do we have? We got tripod legs and all our markers. You want to make sure you don't step on them. So if you can reasonably aim your tripod at each of these, that means you have 9 divided into 360, which is 40 degrees. And then, if you can reasonably position it in between each of those markers, that means you're getting 20-degree angles per shot. So that's really good. The last things I would say for your tripod setup is the leg that you're doing, like pick a leg that you're doing first, and then different people, when they're shooting HDR photography, have different markers that they prefer. I prefer using the sun as my marker. Some people say true north, or, you know, but I think the sun is the easiest mnemonic. So I always start by pointing a tripod leg at the sun, which is where I'm going to start, and then building out from there. So that's the first thing I shoot.
Would you put a compass rose right there and a little,
You can.
a little marker?
You can, and there's some other equipment that you start messing with here. So if you imagine, you have to imagine the camera is on here. I have a little level for the hot shoe of the camera, so it slides in right there, and then you can make sure that your tripod is level. I do one round where it's perfectly level, which equals 18 shots this way, and then I do one at slightly above and slightly below. In theory, there's probably a perfect mathematical amount, but because I just want to make sure that I have things that I can stitch later, what I aim for is making sure that I still have the horizon in either of these. So when I'm pointing at the floor, I want as much of the floor, the lower shot, that still has the horizon in the very top of the viewfinder. And same thing with here. It's mostly sky, but there's a little bit of horizon so that when I start stitching it to the middle row, it'll make sense.
Can you like paint over the top and bottom in Krita?
Yes. And there's other ways you can mask it in Hugin, so that, for instance, like if kids are running through and it totally ruins the shot, kids, you can go into the photo that is wrong and mask that up. A lot of people do that for like the tripod shadow also. The other equipment you need is, I would recommend a high-speed SD card with at least 8 gigs. Because when you're shooting these brackets, you want as much of these shots to happen as close together as possible. Because if you take 15 minutes to shoot this, that means a car might have driven into the scene, the sun might have started setting, people are running through, boats are going along the water. All these things that are in motion are going to mess up why this one doesn't look like this one. So shooting really fast is good. So you need to have a high-speed SD card. This one is a high-speed card. I have one that is large enough but not high-speed, and it's really messing this process up because I'll start shooting and it's recording these, 50 megabyte raw files times 3 per shot. So it takes so long to record it to the card that I have to wait to start shooting the next angle. So then, the next thing you do is modify your camera settings. So what you want to do is be in manual mode. I wish we could look at it. I'll post a picture on my blog later of what settings I use. You want to be in manual mode. You want to have autofocus on. Just focus once and then turn autofocus off because you don't want it focusing per angle. And then the stuff I use is if you're shooting outdoors, start with shutter speed of 1/100th, an ISO of 100, and a lens angle, or an aperture of f/16. And again, I'll write all these notes down on the internet later. And that's a pretty good starting point for daylight. And then you're going to modify your brackets. The first thing you have to do to modify it for bracketing is set it to a 2-second timer, or an amount of time. So when you do that, then you go to where it says exposure, and if you pull the little thing, this is not a Canon, you'll have to check your own cameras for how to change this. You can then spread the exposure. And so that's basically the gist of it. We would shoot it here, but we're recording video. But I can show you a lot of this stuff.
Got a camera in my car if you want to use
Yeah, I got some stuff that I took pretty good. So now, that's the physical shooting thing. So I end up with 18 in the middle, 18 above, and 18 below. And now if you guys want to crowd around a laptop, woo, we're not in the computer lab yet, you can start looking at some of the stuff that I shot.